Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. This is a story about an island, about survival, and about the strange mercy of being found by something you never knew was looking for you. 7 days since the jungle group left, and the base camp had found its rhythm. It was not a comfortable rhythm. Comfort was not quite available yet. Not on this island, not at this stage. But it was a rhythm nonetheless. Morning came the same way each day, the light arriving first through the high canopy in long broken columns, then the sound of the camp stirring, then the fire. People had settled into their tasks with the quiet purposefulness of survivors who have passed through the first panic and arrived at the harder, steadier work of simply continuing. Water from the upland stream, edible foliage from Adaeze's catalogue, fishing from the lower rocks at the base of the bluff. 2 people rotating through shifts in a schedule Connor had drawn up on a torn piece of packaging with a charred stick. 11 had gone into the jungle, Renata leading, Reed beside her with his careful, watchful silence, Patrice with her medical kit strapped across her back, Marcus, Haruki, Zach and Elise, and 4 others whose names the remaining camp had already begun to say less often. Not from forgetting, but from the discipline of people who have decided that worrying about the ones who left will not bring them back faster. 11 people into the trees, and the camp that remained had reorganized itself around the gap. Connor had not stopped building. The camp was better than it had been just a few days prior. Tighter, more deliberate, the platforms reinforced with lashing techniques he had spent 2 evenings teaching to whoever was willing to learn. But it was slower going now, and he knew why, and he did not say it aloud. Marcus had been the one person in camp who could follow Connor's instructions without needing them explained twice, who could look at a structural problem and see the solution at the same moment Connor did, whose hands were strong enough and patient enough to do the kind of sustained, unglamorous work that actual construction required. Without him, Connor found himself repeating things, waiting, adjusting his expectations downward by small increments that added up by the end of the day to a noticeable gap between where he wanted to be and where they were. He did not complain. It wasn't in him to complain about this kind of thing. But Sam had noticed. Sam noticed most things, in the steady, unhurried way of a man who had learned to pay attention, and one evening had simply appeared beside Connor at the frame he was lashing and begun working in silence, following the pattern without being shown, getting it right, on the first attempt. Connor had not said anything. He had just moved over slightly to give him more room, and they had worked together until the light left, and that had been enough. Sam's shoulder was still healing, a bad dislocation from the crash that Patrice had set in those first chaotic hours on the beach, and there were things he could not do, weight he could not bear, angles that cost him more than he let on. But he found the things he could do and did them without drawing attention to the ones he couldn't, and Connor had learned to read the slight hesitation before certain lifts and simply redirect without making anything of it. That was its own kind of language. Tom had started helping too, which was something Connor had been waiting for since the first week without saying so. He was a structural engineer, retired, but that was not the kind of knowledge that retired, and in the days after the crash he had been in no condition to apply it. The jet fuel had found him when the fuselage broke apart, a wave of it igniting across his left side, and the burns had been the kind that Val managed with a careful, grim efficiency that said everything about their severity, without needing to name it. He had spent the first 2 weeks horizontal, then upright but still, then moving slowly in the way of a man relearning the relationship between intention and pain. The skin on his left arm and shoulder was still healing in the taut, tender way of deep burns, pulling when he reached, protesting certain angles, and he wore a long-sleeved shirt even in the heat, which nobody commented on because some things do not need commenting on. But he was here now, standing beside Connor in the mornings, looking at the frames and the platforms and the lashing work, with the particular attention of someone who sees structure the way others see colour. He could not lift heavy timber, he could not climb, but he could look at a joint and tell you in 3 words whether it would hold, and that was worth more to Connor than the lifting. Val moved through the camp the way she always moved, and with the authority of someone who is not performing authority but simply has it, the kind that comes from being the person others look toward when they don't know what to do. She checked in with each cluster of people without making it feel like rounds. She remembered names, details, the small specific complaints that people mentioned once and assumed forgotten. She kept the group together not through any single act but through accumulated attention and genuine care. Cammy watched her do this from across the camp and felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not quite admiration, or not only that. The morning was clear and warm, the sky above the canopy a particular shade of deep blue that made the island feel briefly like somewhere a person might choose to be. The fire was going. Gérard, a retired French schoolteacher from Lyon, who had become one of the quiet, reliable presences of the camp, was boiling water in a salvaged tin near the base of the fig tree, moving with the deliberate economy of a man in his late 60s who has learned to conserve effort without sacrificing thoroughness. Alinta was nearby, sitting on the platform edge with her legs dangling, watching the clearing the way she watched most things, with an unhurried attention that had taken some of the other survivors time to understand was not indifference, but its opposite. She was 26, from a small community outside Darwin, Australia, and she had the quality of stillness that belongs to people who grew up in large, open landscapes, where you learn early that rushing towards something does not make it arrive faster. Her accent was thick and warm and had confused several people in the camp who expected Australian to sound a certain way and found something older and more particular in her vowels, something that sat in the mouth differently, that carried its own geography. She and Grace had found each other in the 2nd week, drawn together by the coincidence of being 2 young women with accents so pronounced that the others sometimes had to ask them to repeat themselves, and had stayed close with the easy loyalty of people who have been made to feel like a lot, and found in each other an uncomplicated relief from that. Grace's southern drawl and Alinta's broad aboriginal lilt made an unlikely pair, but a natural one, both carrying languages that were not quite what the world had come to expect from the countries they came from, both entirely at home in the sound of themselves. It was, all things considered, a good morning, which is when Connor found Val. He appeared at her shoulder without announcement, the way Connor always appeared, quietly, directly, already having decided what needed to be said. He told her Sam was not right. He had been watching him since first light, and something was off. The eyes, the stillness, the way he was sitting against the fig tree and not quite tracking the world around him. He said it without drama, the way he reported all practical problems. Here is the thing, here is why it matters, and here is who needs to know. Val put down what she was doing and went. She had been watching Grace already, had noticed something at breakfast, the quality of her stillness shifting from contemplative to something with a current running through it, her eyes moving too fast, tracking something that was not there. She had filed it and continued moving. Now she crossed the camp with the focused efficiency of someone who has just upgraded a concern from possible to probable. She crouched beside Grace first. The eyes were wrong. Not wrong the way fear makes eyes wrong, or grief. Wrong the way a frequency that has drifted off its signal sounds wrong. Close to the right thing, but not quite, and that gap is the part that troubles you. "Oh, I'm fine," Grace said. The words were correct. The way she said them was not. Val put the back of her hand against Grace's forehead and felt the heat radiating off her before she made contact. Not a mild fever, not the kind you rest through, the kind that makes the air around a person feel different. She was already moving to her kit when she understood that Grace was not the first. Flashback, Samson, Washington, D.C., 6 years earlier. Samson had a gift for finding what people tried to hide. That was how his supervisor at the firm had described it during his third-year review. Not as a compliment exactly, though it was meant as one, more as an observation about the kind of mind Samson had. Forensic accounting was, at its core, pattern recognition. Numbers told stories. They always did. And the stories they told when someone was trying to make them lie were different in texture and rhythm from the stories they told when they were simply reporting the truth. Samson could feel the difference the way a musician feels a note that is slightly off, not always able to say precisely where, but unable to unhear it. The Devereaux case took 14 months. Callaway Devereaux was a United States Senator, the kind of politician whose name appeared on buildings, whose face appeared at openings and ribbon cuttings, whose brand of civic visibility had been carefully constructed over 2 decades to communicate trustworthiness the way a building communicates permanence. He sat on 3 Senate committees, 2 of which had direct oversight of housing and urban development. He was the son of Edison Devereaux, a man of considerable and somewhat opaque wealth, whose name appeared on the boards of 6 private foundations with interests spanning 3 continents, and who had spent 40 years cultivating the kind of influence that does not require a title because it precedes whoever holds one. Callaway had inherited both the name and the instinct, though he had applied them in the specific direction that political ambition tends to take things, carefully, visibly, and always, within the letter of whatever law currently applied to him. Samson had been handed the case as a routine audit referral, a federal housing development grant program that was showing anomalies in its disbursement pattern. Not dramatic anomalies, subtle ones, the kind that look like administrative inefficiency until you pull the thread. The grants were administered through a non-profit called the Devereaux Foundation for Community Development, which bore the senator's family name but was technically independent, chaired by a college roommate of Callaway's, who had since become a real estate attorney in suburban Virginia. The foundation disbursed federal money to residential development projects in underserved districts. It was a good program, on paper. Samson had no reason to assume otherwise when he started. In month 12, working late on a Thursday with a cup of coffee going cold beside his keyboard, he found the pattern. The foundation was skimming. Not dramatically, never dramatically, that was the craft of it, but consistently, from the maintenance and oversight line items of every grant it administered. The money was not going to the senator directly. It flowed through a series of intermediaries, a property oversight consulting firm, an inspection services company, a compliance reporting contractor, each of which was connected, at 2 or 3 removes, to a family trust that listed among its beneficiaries the senator and his heirs. The structures were elaborate and entirely legal in their individual components. Together they constituted the most sophisticated quiet theft Samson had ever seen. And because the money that was being skimmed was maintenance funding, the money that paid for roofs and heating systems and fire suppression inspections, the buildings deteriorated at a rate that looked like ordinary age and not like theft. There had been a fire. 3 people had died. One of them was a child. The fire had happened 8 months before Samson was handed the case. It was not officially connected to the audit referral. Samson connected it himself alone on a Thursday night with a cold cup of coffee and the specific, airless feeling of understanding something that cannot be understood without also understanding that it is too late. He had done everything right, the report, the referral, the testimony. And then the verdict came down, and Samson sat in the gallery and watched Calloway Devereaux receive 3 years of probation. No prison, no cell, no facility, 3 years of probation, a suspended sentence, and a fine that represented less than 2% of what the Foundation had skimmed over the course of a decade. Devereaux had stood at the defence table in a suit that cost more than most of the residents of those deteriorating buildings made in a month, and he had accepted the terms with the practised composure of a man who had known all along that it would go this way. Samson sat in the gallery for a long time after the room cleared. He was thinking about Edison Devereaux, about the 6 foundations, the 3 continents, the 40 years of influence carefully cultivated at a remove from any title or office. He thought about the judge, who had been appointed to the bench 12 years prior by a senator who had since retired to a lobbying firm, whose client list Samson had never had cause to examine. He could not prove anything. That was the particular cruelty of it, that the numbers stopped where he could see them, and everything beyond that point was inference. He was a forensic accountant. He followed numbers, and the numbers told him a man had stolen from the poorest people in his district and left 3 of them dead. And the numbers also told him that the consequence of this was 3 years of probation and a fine paid by the end of the fiscal quarter. He had not slept well since. That was the honest accounting of it. There had been one other thing, a detail Samson had noted in the margin of his own private file, and then set aside, because it was not relevant to the case and it was not his business. Devereaux had been in a relationship for several years prior to the investigation with a woman whose name appeared occasionally in his personal correspondence, and once in a deposition that a paralegal had flagged and then unflagged, a sitting United States Congresswoman, young, unusually young for the office, the kind of young that had made news when she was first elected. Samson had seen her face before, at a function in the Capitol Rotunda 2 years prior, and then again on television, giving a floor statement on a military appropriations bill, her voice measured and her yes vote delivered without hesitation. He had noted her name in the margin of his private file, and then set it aside. He was not that kind of investigator. He followed the numbers, not the people. The numbers were enough. Or they should have been. He thought about it now, in whatever place the fever had taken him. Not the camp, not the island, not quite anywhere. The fever had found the faces he kept in the locked part of his mind, the victims, the charred remains of 3 people who had trusted that the world was more honest than it was, who had gone to sleep in a building that should have been safe and had not woken up. The fever lifted those faces out of the place he had kept them and set them in front of him with a clarity that the waking world, mercifully, did not usually allow, and in the strange, compressed logic of whatever the island was doing to his mind, those faces resolved into one face. The face was Grace's. He did not know why. The fever did not explain itself. His hands knew what they wanted to do. The island held its breath. Sam was worse. He was a big man, one of the biggest in the camp, broad through the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that usually made people feel safer, just by proximity. He had been one of the quieter members of the group since the crash, reliable in the way people are reliable when they have decided that competence is the most useful thing they can offer. He had helped build the tree platforms. He had carried twice what anyone asked him to carry without complaint, even with a healing shoulder. He was friendly and kind, in a way that made people gravitate toward him without quite knowing why. Now he was sitting on his sleeping mat with his back against the trunk of the large strangler fig that anchored the east side of the camp, and he was talking. Not to anyone, not about anything. A low, continuous murmur, words that were almost words, almost sentences, almost coherent, but not quite. His eyes were half open and moving, tracking something that had no location in the visible world. Val crouched beside him and checked his eyes, his temperature, the quality of his breathing. The fever was higher than Grace's. His skin was dry where it should have been damp. His pupils were uneven in a way that made something in her chest do a slow, unhappy turn. Cammy appeared at the edge of the platform above and asked what it was. Val did not answer right away. She was a trauma surgeon. She was trained to see damage and to fix it. This was not damage, exactly. This was something the island had done, or allowed, or encouraged, and those were not categories that her training covered. She straightened up. She looked at the sky, at the canopy of woven branches above them that Connor had spent days engineering, and she breathed. She told them she did not know yet. It happened fast. Val was beside Sam on the east platform, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead, then his neck, reading what the skin told her, when she noticed the change in his breathing. It had been shallow and quick. Now it was slow and too deliberate, as though he were counting the intervals between breaths, as though the act of breathing had become a conscious decision. She said his name, evenly, without alarm. The voice you use when the situation requires you not to communicate what you are feeling. He did not respond in any way she recognized as response. His lips were still moving. The murmuring had changed in quality, lower now, more rhythmic, like something being recited rather than said, some internal text she could not read. She reached for the cup of water beside his mat, thinking to try to get him to drink, and that was when she felt the shift in the platform beneath her. Not a sound. The tree camp did not creak the way a wooden structure creaks, but a change in weight distribution, subtle and sudden, that her body registered before her mind did. Sam was on his feet. He had come upright the way a machine comes online, not slowly, not with the laboured uncertainty of a sick man rising, but all at once, a switch thrown. His eyes were open, and they were completely wrong. The pupils had blown wide in the morning light, black and enormous, and they were fixed on something that had no location in the visible world. She said his name again, moved to put herself between him and the edge of the platform. He turned toward her, and for 1/2 second she saw recognition flash through his face. Something that knew who she was, that registered her presence, and then it was gone, overwritten by whatever the fever had put in its place. He stepped around her, not violently, not with aggression, with the calm, deliberate movement of a man who knows where he is going and what he intends to do when he gets there, and who has no capacity in this moment to consider that it might be wrong. He was already at the rope ladder before she found her voice. She called for Connor. The word came out sharp and high enough to cut through the ordinary sounds of the morning camp. She heard him answer from somewhere on the west side, heard the change in his footfall that meant he had started moving without knowing yet why. But Sam was already down. The rope ladder should have been difficult for a man in his condition. The rungs required coordination, balance, the kind of proprioception that fever strips away. He descended it as though the fever had taken everything from him except the specific, terrible competence required for this one task. By the time Connor reached the base of the ladder, Sam was already crossing the open ground of the camp, moving in a straight line toward the fig tree. Grace was there. She had been there all morning, sitting with her back against the fig's great exposed root, her knees drawn up, murmuring the way she had been murmuring since the fever took her. Not words exactly, a low, continuous sound, the voice a person makes when they are far away from themselves. She had not heard him coming. She had not heard anything since the fever began. She was somewhere else entirely, and she had no warning. Sam's hands went to her throat, not grasping, not the panicked, uncontrolled grip of someone acting from emotion, with purpose, with the specific, horrible intentionality of someone who believes completely in what they are doing, who is not, in this moment, the man who carried twice what was asked of him without complaint, the father of a daughter named Adaeze, whose name he had spoken into the dark on the first night, and not again. He was somewhere else. He was the fever's version of him, the thing that lived in the thought he had never acted on, the locked room the island had broken open. Grace made a sound that was very small and very wrong. Alinta was on her feet before anyone else. She had been on the platform above and had seen it, had seen Sam's descent and understood what his body language meant before anyone on the ground had registered it, with the alertness of someone who grew up reading landscape and movement for information. She was already coming down the ladder as Connor crossed the camp, and the moment Sam reached Grace, she came in from the other side, not hesitating, not calling for help first, not performing any of the deliberation that fear usually inserts between understanding and action. She got hold of Sam's left arm and drove her weight into it with everything she had, which was not inconsiderable. She was slight, but she was strong in the specific way of people who have done physical work their whole lives, and she knew how to use her body as leverage rather than force. Connor hit him from the side. He had crossed the camp at a run the moment he understood what he was seeing, and he did not slow down, did not call out, did not perform any of the warning behaviors that might have given Sam time to brace. He hit him with his full body weight, the tackle of a man who spent a decade absorbing collisions and knew instinctively how to deliver one. The two of them went sideways into the undergrowth at the base of the fig, and Connor was already getting his arms around him before they hit the ground. Sam was stronger than he should have been. That was the first thing Connor understood in the first 3 seconds of trying to hold him, that the fever had done something to the ordinary limits, had stripped away the governor that tells a body how much force it can reasonably apply. He was holding 220 pounds of a man who was somewhere beyond pain and fatigue, who was not registering exhaustion or injury, who was working from a source of energy that Connor had no frame of reference for. The shoulder that had been healing in its sling for weeks, the dislocation that had kept Sam from the heaviest work, that had made him careful and deliberate in everything he lifted, was registering nothing. Whatever the fever had done to the thresholds of his mind, it had done the same to his body. He was using the arm fully, without protection, without hesitation, without any awareness that it was costing him anything. Connor could feel it in the way Sam moved, the complete absence of self-preservation that ordinarily shapes how an injured person holds themselves. He was not holding back. He could not hold back. The fever had removed that option entirely. Between the two of them, Connor controlling the torso, Alinta anchoring the arm, they kept him on the ground. Sam did not fight the way a person fights when they are trying to escape. He fought the way a person fights when they are trying to complete a task. Redirecting, persisting, finding new angles, his body still oriented toward Grace even as they held him. It took 3 full minutes to restrain him. Connor counted. 3 minutes of elbows and knees finding purchase, of both of them taking impacts they would feel the next morning, of the strange, terrible intimacy of holding a person you trust against the thing his own mind has become. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Not gradually, not a slow deflation. All at once, like a power cut. Sam went still and then went heavy, his body releasing whatever had been driving it, and what was left was simply a man on the ground between 2 people who had given what was required of them, his face turned into the dirt, his hands open and empty. And then he was weeping. Great, heaving, inconsolable sobs, the kind that come from somewhere below words, below thought, from the part of a person that understands what has happened even when the rest of them does not yet. His hands were open, and he was looking at them the way you look at something you do not recognize as belonging to you. He said Abina's name. Once. Quietly. Connor's grip on him did not loosen. But something in it changed. Val moved immediately to Grace, crossing the few feet between them, one hand at Grace's neck checking the pulse, the other at her airway running the assessment with quick, practiced hands. Bruising. Some pressure trauma. Her colour was returning and her breathing was stabilizing. Alinta was there a moment later, settling beside Grace, one hand on her arm, not moving, not talking, just present in the way she was always present, completely and without demand. Grace was okay. She would be okay. Val sat back and said, clearly and loudly enough for the camp to hear, that it was the fever. It was not him. It was the fever. "Do you hear me?" she said. "It is not him." Nobody argued. Nobody agreed. They just stood at the edges of what had happened and looked at Sam weeping in the dirt and Grace breathing in the undergrowth and the ordinary morning light falling through the canopy onto a camp that was no longer the same camp it had been an hour ago. It was evening. She gathered them in the center of the camp. She did not waste words. She told them she had a fever. She had noticed it this morning. She had been monitoring it. It was moving fast. She looked at them in turn, not asking for anything, just establishing facts. By tomorrow, she said, she expected she would not be reliable, which meant the 2 of them, she looked at Cammy, then at Connor, needed to have a plan. "What do you mean by not reliable?" Connor asked. "Like Grace," she told him, possibly like Sam, though she was hoping slower. She paused. "We all just watched what the fever does when it reaches a certain point." She said it without drama. "We cannot let it get that far again." Cammy made a sound that was not a word, turned away briefly, turned back. Something in her jaw was very tight. Connor was watching Val with the expression he used when he was deciding whether to argue. That careful, suspended stillness. The moment before the fisherman decides whether to let the line run. She told them they needed to work together. That was not a request. They had sick people, and she did not know what this was, and she did not know if it was going to stop where it was. She looked at Connor, then at Cammy. "You know this camp and these people," she said. "Keep them calm, keep them away from the sick, and find Adaeze." Connor looked at Cammy. Cammy looked at Connor. There was a slight, familiar tension in the air between them. Val interrupted it by asking where Adaeze was. Cammy told her she had gone out before anyone was up, heading south. "Then someone needs to find her," Val said. And then, more quietly, more for herself than for them, she is the one who's going to figure this out. Part 4. Connor and Cammy. The argument started before Val had finished walking away. It was not loud. Cammy and Connor were both people who, under ordinary circumstances, did not raise their voices. Their conflicts ran quieter than that. The kind of pressure that builds beneath the surface and speaks through silences and pauses, and the precise selection of certain words over certain other words. "They should move them," Cammy said, "the sick ones. Separate shelter, upwind, until they understood what they were dealing with. And given what Sam's fever was already doing, the sooner the better." "Moving them across the platforms risks a fall," Connor said. Sam was 220 pounds. Grace was not far behind. Did she want to carry them through the canopy? She suggested building a ground shelter. They were in the tree camp because the ground camp got destroyed, he said. The ground was not safe. "It was the storm that was not safe," Cammy said. "The ground itself is where things come from," Connor said. "The ground is not the answer." "Val asked us to work together," Cammy said. "Quiet. Flat. The particular flatness of someone who has identified the center of a problem and is addressing it directly." A silence. "She asked me first," Connor said. And there it was. Something small and sharp and honest. A sentence that should have been about logistics but was not. Cammy looked at him. He did not look away. In the space between them, something crackled that had been building for a while. That had nothing to do with the sick and everything to do with the way Val had looked at Cammy the previous evening, and the way Connor had noticed her looking. "This is not about Val," Cammy said. "I know," Connor said. "Then act like it," she retorted. And she walked away, which was the only direction either of them could walk that would make them useful. Connor stood for a moment. He looked at the sky through the canopy. He exhaled. Then he followed her. Adaeze had been following the smell. She knew how that sounded. She was a scientist. She was precise. She built arguments from data. But the truth was that the island did not always give you data first. Sometimes it gave you a sensation. And if you had learned, over 29 years of being curious about the world, to trust your senses as the first instrument before the more sophisticated ones, you followed the sensation and found the data later. The smell was green and faintly medicinal, the way certain plants smell when you crush a leaf between your fingers. Not unpleasant, but specific in the way that specific smells are. The kind that snags something in the memory even when you're not sure what. She pushed through a dense screen of ferns and stopped. The clearing was small, barely wider than her arm span in any direction, and ringed with undergrowth so thick it was clearly not accidental. At its center, growing in a cluster around the base of a large flat stone, were plants she recognized immediately. Her chest did a complicated thing. She crouched and touched a leaf, thick, waxy, triangular, with a faint silver iridescence along its underside that had no business existing in this part of the world. The root structure, where a stem had been partly exposed by some animal digging at the base of the stone, was unlike anything in her training. Layered and interlocking, almost architectural, as if the plant had designed itself rather than grown. She had seen photographs of this root structure once, in a paper that had been flagged as unverifiable and quietly withdrawn from the journal that published it. A paper written by a researcher attached to a remote island botanical program in the South Pacific, sometime in the mid-1980s, whose funding source was listed as a private conservation foundation and whose institutional affiliation had been redacted before publication. She had read it in a colleague's office in Cambridge 4 years ago. Adaeze looked at the plants for a long moment, at her own hands, at the jungle around her pressing in close and attentive, the way it always pressed in on this island, as if the trees were listening. Then she began, very carefully, to collect what she needed. Val was on her mat when it started. She had been expecting it, had been tracking her own temperature with the clinical detachment of a surgeon assessing someone else, noting the rise, the rate, the quality. She knew what it would feel like before it arrived. She had been wrong about how fast. The heat moved through her like a tide, not unpleasant at first, almost like slipping into warm water, that first moment of relief, then tipping past relief into something else, something that altered the light, that made the canopy above her breathe with a subtle wrong rhythm. She heard Cammie's name. She did not know if she had said it aloud. The island spoke to her. That was the only way she could describe it later, when she could describe things again, when language had returned. Not in words exactly, more like pressure, like standing too close to a speaker playing a frequency you can feel but not quite hear. The message was not clear, but the intent was. She saw the jungle as it had been before, a long time before, long before the storm, long before their camp, long before any camp, roots in water, the island smaller, narrower at its centre, the mountain taller, the stones, the nodes, lit from within, all 23 of them, a pattern she could almost read, a geometry she almost understood, like a sentence in a language she had studied but never spoken. Then, a figure at the edge of what she could see, not walking toward her, just standing, patient, the way things stand on this island when they have been waiting for a very long time and have no urgency about the waiting. She tried to see its face. The fever would not let her get that far. When she came back, Cammie was sitting beside her, close, attentive, present in the way she was always present with Val, without making it mean more than the moment required. Val focused on her face until it was the right shape again. "You were talking," Cammie said. "Well, mumbling mostly." "What did I say?" Val asked. Cammie was quiet for a moment. "You said, it already knows." Val closed her eyes. "Okay," she said. And then, very quietly, "Don't leave." "I won't," Cammie said. She meant it. Adaeze came back to camp at mid-afternoon with her foraging bag heavy on her shoulder and her face red and spotted with sweat. She had been out for over 24 hours and she expected to hear about it, especially from Val, who would have had something to say about leaving without telling anyone, or taking someone with her. Connor and Cammie were the first to reach her. "Thank God you're back," Connor said. "We have a situation." Adaeze looked at Connor and Cammie, then around the camp, noting the absence of Sam, Grace and Val. "What did I miss?" she asked. Connor and Cammie explained. The fever, the spread, Sam's violent episode. Adaeze's eyes went wide as it registered. "Plants," she said. Connor and Cammie looked at her. "Plants," Cammie repeated, a question, not a statement. I think I found something that can help with whatever is going on here, Adaeze said, wiping the sweat from her forehead. While I was out foraging, sorry about disappearing by the way, I found a plant that should not technically exist in this part of the world. From what I know of it, from old published research, it has anti-fever properties unlike anything in the conventional pharmacological literature. Not a sedative, not an antipyretic in any ordinary sense, something that addresses the neurological component specifically, the hallucinations, the dissociation, the violence. She paused. Both of them could hear Sam at the edge of the camp, murmuring at the base of the cecropia tree where they had secured him. There was no explanation for the mechanism in what I read, she told them, only the effect. And the effect is what we need right now. Connor looked from the tree line back to Adaeze. Val told us you would be the one to figure this out, he said. I don't know how Val knew that, but she did. How far away is it? Can we go back today to get the plants? Adaeze sighed, wiping her forehead again. It's not close, she said. But fortunately I brought some back to study. She gestured to the bag on her shoulder. Good thing I did. Connor nodded toward the sick end of the camp. Then let's get to it, he said. They gave it to Sam first because he was the worst. The preparation was a tea, the simplest word for it, though what Adaeze made over the camp's small fire was more careful and more deliberate than that word suggested. She worked with the focused economy of someone who has learned that precision in the field is the difference between a result and a disaster. Connor watched every step without commenting. Sam would not drink it at first. He turned his face away, still somewhere else, still speaking his language of fever. It was Alinta who coaxed him, sitting beside him in the dirt, unhurried, saying things quietly in her own language, the broad, warm vowels of it sitting in the air between them like something the island recognized. She did not explain what she was doing. She just talked to him, low and steady, until his face turned towards the sound and his hands stopped pulling away. After a long time, Sam drank. Then Grace. Then, one by one, the others who had come down in the hours while Adaeze was in the jungle. 2 more, both running high fevers, both showing the same wrong frequency quality in their eyes. Val last. Connor brought the cup to her and she drank without opening her eyes, which meant she was trusting the weight of his hand and the sound of his voice and the fact that he was there. It did not work immediately. Nothing real works immediately. But by the time the sun moved behind the mountain and the camp filled with the long gold light of late evening, Sam's murmuring had quieted. Grace was sitting upright without holding on to anything. Somewhere across the platforms, a sound that might have been Val speaking, actual words in the right order, made Connor let go of a breath he had been holding for a long time. Cammy sat at the base of the cecropia tree after the worst of it was over, her back against the bark, her hands in her lap, not sleeping, just present. Adaeze sat down beside her. Cammy asked where she had found them. Adaeze was quiet for a moment. South, she said. Maybe 3 kilometers. A clearing, small, ringed in dense undergrowth with a flat stone at its center. She paused. The plants were growing in the cracks of something buried beneath the ground. Old concrete, she thought. Something that had been built there and had not fully surrendered to the jungle yet. Cammy looked toward the south where the jungle went dark between the trees. We should go there, she said. We'll need to know what else is down there, and we'll need more of this, in case anyone else comes down with it. Yes, Adaeze said. We should. She paused again. Not tonight. No, Cammy agreed, not tonight. The camp breathes. The fever recedes like a tide going out, slow and reluctant, leaving the shore exactly as it found it, which is to say, changed and not quite knowing yet how. Sam sits at the base of the cecropia tree in the deepening evening, the rope loose around his wrists now. More suggestion than restraint, a formality that Connor loosened when his eyes came back to the right frequency. He is not murmuring any more. He is very still, in the way of a person who has returned from somewhere and is waiting for the rest of himself to catch up. Gerard sits beside him. Neither of them is talking. The silence between them has the quality of silences between people who have been through something together and do not need to name it. At some point, Sam reaches across and puts his hand over Gerard's. He keeps it there for a moment. Gerard does not move. That is all. That is enough. Across the camp, Alinta sits beside Grace, who is sleeping now. A proper sleep, the first since the fever took her. Alinta is not sleeping. She is watching Grace the way she watches things, with the steady, patient attention of someone who has decided that presence is the most useful thing she can offer, and is offering it completely. Val is sleeping, actual sleep this time, the deep, surrendered kind, her breathing even, her face doing something it does not usually do in waking hours. Cammy is beside her, quietly watching, mapping the small details of her face the way you map something you are afraid of losing. Connor checks the restraints one last time, loosens the same one he loosened before, makes the same small adjustment. He does not say anything about this. He just does it and moves on to the next thing. South of the tree camp, through 3 kilometers of old-growth jungle, a concrete foundation sits half submerged in the earth. The vines have covered it, the trees have grown through it, but the walls are still standing. And on one wall, legible beneath a decade of moss if you know where to look, a symbol no one in this camp has seen yet. A seedling growing from a circle. Sleep well, the island will be here when you wake up. It always is.